Hello. In response to some questions I've been getting, I realize I need to tell you about control versus execution before the first assignment. It's actually going to be an ongoing theme, but I want to at least give you some introductions as to where it fits in so that you can at least complete that part. As you know from our previous lectures, any idea has a number of business models that can be used to commercialize that idea. Of course, those number of business models is conceptually infinite, but what we want are a set of classifications that can be used to help you in your search for the right business model. So those business models will have broad areas, broad directions, and then you'll slowly hone them down into the business model that you eventually go with, at least first time around. Now, we already provided one means in the last lecture about how to think about those business models, and that was by thinking about the relationships that you as a venture would have with suppliers and with customers. In particular, how you position your product can influence whether your suppliers and customers are what we called sticky or fluid. Remember, an agent is sticky if they have to engage in specific investments that are directed solely at your venture, whereas an agent is fluid if whatever you're asking them to do is something that won't be particularly costly for them, especially if you didn't actually exist. And that gave a number of ways of thinking about different business models. Now, in effect, it was a good starting point, but that doesn't really cover as much as most ventures would consider. So that's why I want to consider an alternative way. Like this previous one, it will consider 2x2s, just a little bit different. Okay. So the first dimension, the columns, in this example, are going to be something we dealt with in the last lecture. That is, who is the real customer in your business model? Is the customer the final consumers that established firms are already competing for? Or is the customer the established firms themselves who are the conduit to those final customers? In other words, are you looking to cooperate with them? As we saw last time, you can choose to orient your business one way or the other. Now, there is another dimension, and here's where we get to what we want to talk about today. You can also think of different models as being centered around control or execution. Let me try and explain that in a little bit more detail here. One, what is control? Well, the description of it is doing things that are designed to give you control over your market in the future. Great example of that is if you secure a patent. If you secure a patent, the idea is that you'll be able to defend your turf against imitators or people doing close similar things. Similarly, another way to get control is to have a first mover advantage that might come from building in a platform, say, with network effects. Something that makes it harder for competitors to take away your customers. For instance, you may acquire customers by discounting heavily in the beginning, knowing that they're not going to have as many options later on to switch away from you, and that's when you'll earn your money. By contrast, execution involves competing all the time. You launch a superior product to others in the marketplace. You generate what you can with lower costs or greater efficiency. In effect, what you try to do is build up capabilities that you can explore and exploit in the future. Now, the difference between these two can probably be put down to two criteria. The first is time to market. With control, time to market is slow. It takes a while to get a patent. It's hard to keep things secret, and it means you have to slow things down to do that. And to get first mover advantages, you've got to get traction. And you've got to be able to take everybody else by surprise, which also takes a little bit of time to get it right. By contrast, execution is faster to market. You can go right out of the gate, make sure you are better than everybody else, make sure you've got minimum viable product that is satisfying consumers better than other alternatives. And you can do that immediately. What you sacrifice there, however, is you sacrifice the ability to do control. If you get to the market quickly, everybody knows about your product, so you can't rely on secrecy. If you get to the market quickly, you don't have time to get a patent. Now, you might get one in the future, but all of a sudden you're in the fray. And also, to do things that get you a first mover advantage are also somewhat inconsistent with it, and something we'll hopefully explore a little later. The second dimension from which control and execution differ, because at the moment you'd think that execution was the way to go, is of course future returns. Your future returns when you've controlled something come from the unique assets that your venture ends up acquiring. That might be intellectual property, but it might be certain amounts of things that you might build, or it might be the acquisition of users. Let's think about the Snapchat model as an example of that. By contrast, with execution, your future returns come from unique capabilities. These are special things that you might have that always gives you the ability to have a lead in the market. Think Apple as a good example of a company that has unique capabilities. Now, the problem with unique capabilities is they have to be refreshed all the time, whereas unique assets are something you own and can exploit. So the execution route is harder work. It's harder work, ongoing. There's not going to be a break at the end. However, it might be the better way to go. It might be the only way to go in some instances. So let's shove all this back into a 2x2. Given these two dimensions, control versus execution and compete versus cooperate, what are some of the business models that arise? Well, the first is if you both compete and you focus on execution, that is consistent with what we'd call a disruptive strategy. Disruptive strategy, you will recall, has some relationship between taking established firms head on, but not in the way of controlling something. Instead, you're trying to beat them at what they're currently good at. That means you have to have a better product or lower costs. And that's the essence of where disruption comes from, at least for some segment of the consumers. If you choose the opposite end of the spectrum, that you look for control and you seek to cooperate, we're in what's called an intellectual property strategy. In that situation, what you're doing is trying to get some assets, particularly IP assets, that you can license or sell to established firms. If you choose to execute and still hit at cooperating with established firms, that's what's called a value chain strategy. Effectively, what you're doing is slotting yourself into an existing value chain, being better than the other people in that value chain, and ongoingly so, that's the execution part, but ultimately you're competing for the right to sell to customers that are established firms. So you're competing for the right to cooperate. And the only way you're going to get priority there is if you're actually better than your rivals. Finally, if you choose to try to control and you choose to compete, it's what we call an architectural strategy. This is a strategy whereby you set the architecture for the future industry. A great example of a firm that does this is, of course, Facebook. Facebook pioneered the idea that you set the core of a social network as its activity stream. They control that. Everything they've done is to ever control that, and everything else is to build off that architecture. That's what Facebook does. So that gives you an overview into control and execution, certainly enough for you to complete that relevant part of your assignment. But in the rest of this lecture, lecture 3B if you will, we'll hopefully explore this in a bit more detail.